Helen Mirren stood up in the middle of someone else's sentence, not her own. Jimmy Fallon was speaking. Mid-question, mid-thought. His voice still carrying the easy rhythm of an interview going beautifully, and Helen Mirren placed both hands flat on the arms of her chair and rose, and the sentence Jimmy had been constructing simply ceased to exist, dissolving into the air of the studio the way a thought dissolves when something more urgent arrives. She was not looking at him. She was not looking at the audience. She was standing very still with her head slightly turned toward the speaker, mounted above the stage-left entrance. And her face had done something that 300 people in that studio had never seen it do in any film, or any interview, or any public moment in a career that had spanned 6 decades. It had stopped performing entirely. Not frozen, not blank, present in a different way, stripped of the particular intelligence and warmth and control that are always visible in her face when she is in front of people, replaced by something older and more private. The face of a woman standing alone in a room that only she is standing in, hearing something that no one else in the studio could yet understand. Jimmy Fallon stopped speaking. He stopped speaking the way you stop when something overrides the sentence, when the room suddenly contains something more important than the words you were forming. And he sat with his hands on the desk and looked at Helen Mirren standing beside her chair, and felt tears arrive on his face before he had any cause for them, before he had any explanation, which is the only way the truest things ever arrive, ahead of reason, in the body, before the mind has caught up to what the body already knows. He did not speak. He did not move. He sat in the good silence of a man who understands he is watching something he has no business interrupting. The Roots did not play. A woman in the 3rd row set down the glass of water she had been holding and did not pick it back up. The director in the control room said nothing to no one. The cameras kept rolling with the particular diligence of cameras that understand, in the way cameras do, that they are recording something that will not happen twice. For 36 seconds, Helen Mirren stood beside her chair on the stage of The Tonight Show and listened to a voice coming from a speaker above the entrance, and said nothing and went nowhere. And the entire studio held itself around her the way a cupped hand holds water, carefully, collectively, without spilling a drop. Then she said, very quietly, to no one in particular, and to everyone, "That's Nora." It was a Thursday night taping. October 2023. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Helen Mirren was the guest, 78 years old, still carrying herself with the particular uprightness that is not stiffness, but authority. The specific gravity of a woman who has been one of the most precise and uncompromising screen presences in the history of British acting, and who has spent 6 decades building the instrument she works with and has never once been careless with it. The audience had given her a standing ovation that began before she reached her chair, the kind that acknowledges not just the person, but the entirety of what they represent, the full weight of a life spent doing the work with complete seriousness. She had been luminous and dry and funny in the way that only comes from genuine confidence, the kind of funny that does not need anyone to think it is funny, and therefore almost always is. The room was warm and easy. Jimmy was in full flight. Everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. Jimmy had told her he had a small surprise. A brief audio clip, something found in the Tonight Show archive, something he thought she might find interesting. He had said it with the smile he wears when he is nervous, which is slightly more composed than his ordinary smile, and Helen Mirren had looked at him with the clear-eyed assessment of a woman who has been reading people professionally for 60 years, and had said, with the dry precision that is entirely her own, "You are a terrible liar, James." But she had settled back in her chair and nodded. He pressed play. The voice that came from the speaker above the stage left entrance was a woman's voice. Not loud, not performative, just a voice. English. Not London, something older in it. Regional in a way that placed it somewhere in the Midlands or the North. The particular music of an accent that had been shaped by a specific place and had never entirely left it. The woman was speaking in the measured, deliberate way of someone being recorded for a purpose, which meant the words were chosen. But beneath the choosing there was something natural and warm. The voice of someone for whom warmth was the default register. She was talking about theater. About what the stage demanded of the actor in ways that film could not replicate. The live exchange. The unrepeatable nature of each performance. The specific electricity of a shared room. She said, "The stage teaches you that it is not about you. It is never about you. It is always about the person who is watching from the dark. When you understand that, really understand it, all the way through, you become able to disappear into the work entirely. And the disappearing is the arriving." The voice stopped. Helen Mirren had already stood up. She was standing beside her chair with both hands flat on the armrests she had just released, her head tilted toward the speaker, her face entirely stripped of the professional composure that had been there a moment before. Jimmy Fallon was looking at her. The room was looking at her. 300 people were very still. She said, "That's Nora." And the entire studio froze. The entire studio froze. Not the quick freeze of shock, the slow freeze of recognition spreading outward from the stage to the band to the wings, to every row of the audience, person by person. The way cold moves through a room when a window opens, until the entire space was held in the same stillness. A camera moved slightly to find Helen Mirren's face, and then stopped moving. The director did not call a cut. The producer in the wings stood with her arms at her sides, and felt something she would describe later only as the sensation of watching the room become a different room. Was she all right? Was the voice someone who had hurt her? Someone whose sudden return through a speaker was an intrusion or a wound? Was she unwell? 300 strangers held the question in the dark, with the patience of people who have decided that the waiting is the right thing, and that breaking it would cost something irretrievable. Helen Mirren stood beside her chair and looked at nothing that was in the room. She was somewhere else. She was somewhere that none of the 300 people could follow. And she stood in that private somewhere for 36 seconds, and the room held her in it the way a room holds the one thing it understands matters most. Then she turned to Jimmy. "Where did you find that?" she said. "To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1963. Helen Mirren wasn't always Helen Mirren, not the Academy Award, and the 11 BAFTAs, and the 6 decades of work that had made her one of the defining screen presences of the English-speaking world. The woman who could play a queen and make the queen feel like a person. Who could play a detective and make the detective feel like a conscience. Who could take any role and find in it the exact human truth that the role had been written around and give that truth back to an audience with a precision and a generosity that looked effortless, because she had worked for 40 years to make it look that way. Before all of that, there was a girl from Hammersmith, West London, born Ilyena Vasilyevna Murov, the granddaughter of a Russian migrant, a young woman at 16 who had felt the pull of the stage with the specific violence of a vocation arriving and had begun to follow it before she fully understood where it was going. She had joined the National Youth Theatre at 17. It was 1963, and the night was still a young institution, only 6 years old, still finding its shape, still working out what it was and what it could become, and she had come into it with the raw intensity that she would carry throughout her career. the sense that the work was urgent and serious, and deserved to be treated as exactly that, which made her, at 17, simultaneously the most committed and the most difficult person in any room she occupied. Nora Shelton ran the voice workshops at the National Youth Theatre. She was 57 years old in 1963. She had spent 30 years working in theater, not as an actress, never on the stage herself, but in the unglamorous and essential work that happens before the stage: the voice, the breath, the body, the instrument. She had trained under the great voice teachers of the 1940s and had developed her own method from their foundations, a method built on a single conviction that she returned to in every class, every workshop, every individual session, which was that the actor's instrument was not the voice or the body separately, but the entire person, and that you could not develop the one without attending to the other. She was not a gentle teacher. She was a precise teacher, which is harder to find and rarer and worth far more. Helen Mirren at 17 was, by her own later account, not easy to teach. She was certain she already knew things she did not yet know, which is the particular condition of the very gifted at the beginning of their development, the talent arriving ahead of the craft, the confidence ahead of the competence, the sense of capability preceding the actual capability by just enough to make the gap invisible from the inside. Nora Shelton saw this immediately. She did not address it directly, which would have produced resistance. She simply taught into it, assigned exercises that exposed precisely where the confidence was outrunning the technique, and then, when the exposure happened, said nothing critical, but only what was next, what needed building, what required attention. 6 months in, at the end of a session that had gone badly for reasons Helen Mirren did not fully understand, she had stayed in the room after the others left. Nora Shelton was gathering her things at the table at the front when Helen came to stand near her. She said, "I don't understand what I'm doing wrong." Nora Shelton looked at her for a long moment, with the steadiness of a woman who had been looking at actors for 30 years and had stopped being surprised by them. Then she said, "You are not doing anything wrong. You are doing something early. There is a version of you that will do this work at a level that very few people in any generation manage, and that version requires only time and honesty. You have the time. The honesty is the part you are working on." She paused. She said, "The stage teaches you that it is not about you. It is never about you. It is always about the person who is watching from the dark. When you understand that, really understand it all the way through, you become able to disappear into the work entirely. And the disappearing is the arriving." Helen Mirren was 17 years old, and she stood in the empty room, and she absorbed it the way you absorb things at 17, when someone you respect says them plainly, completely, without the filtering that comes later, straight through. She did not know in that moment that those 2 sentences would become the foundation of everything she built in the subsequent 6 decades. She did not know that she would hear them in her mind at difficult moments in roles she could not crack, that they would return to her in the particular way that certain sentences return when the work demands them. She only knew, standing in the empty room at 17, that she had just been told something true by someone who had seen something real. She worked with Nora Shelton for 3 years, through the National Youth Theatre and into her early professional career. Nora Shelton watched her develop with the attention of someone invested in an outcome, and she gave her, across those 3 years, the specific and repeated gift of telling her exactly where she was and what was next. Never where she ought to be, and never flattery about where she already was. When Helen Mirren left for the Resk at 20, Nora Shelton gave her nothing except what she had always given: a direct look and a brief nod, and the unspoken understanding that the teaching was complete, and the doing was now entirely Helen's own. Nora Shelton died in 1981. She was 75. She had spent her last working years at a small drama school in Sheffield, teaching voice and breath and instrument to students who largely did not understand yet what they were receiving, which is the common condition of students receiving good teaching. She had followed Helen Mirren's career with the private pride of someone who does not require acknowledgement, because the work itself is the acknowledgement. Watching each performance and recognizing in it specific things she had planted in specific sessions in specific rooms. The way a gardener recognizes in a mature tree the particular characteristics of the seedling she tended. She had died without telling anyone about those sessions, because they were not hers to tell. They had happened between her and a student, and what happened between a teacher and a student was, in her understanding, private, belonging to the work and to the two people who had done it, not to the story of either one of them. Her granddaughter had found the recording in a shoebox. Nora Shelton had recorded herself once, in the early 1970s, at the request of a colleague who was writing a book about voice training. The recording had been made in her kitchen, sitting at the table, speaking into a reel-to-reel that her colleague had set up, and she had talked for an hour about voice and theater and the actor's instrument. And the book had never been written, and the colleague had returned the tape, and it had lived in a shoebox in Sheffield for 50 years. The granddaughter had found it while clearing the house after her own mother's passing, had listened to it on an afternoon in January with a borrowed reel-to-reel player and a cup of tea, and had felt, when her grandmother reached the section about disappearing into the work, a physical sensation she described later as a door opening that she had not known was there. She had looked up the phrase. She had found it. In an interview, in a profile, in a documentary, in a dozen places across Helen Mirren's public statements over 50 years. Always in slightly different words, but always the same thought. Always traceable to the same source. She had understood what she had found. She had written a letter to a production company on a Tuesday evening in September, methodically and without drama, the way her grandmother would have written it. The letter had arrived on a Wednesday. By Thursday afternoon, it was in the hands of someone who knew exactly what it was. Behind the scenes, Helen Mirren had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. She had called the executive producer directly, not through her representation, directly, the same evening the recording was forwarded to her. She had been quiet for a moment after the producer finished explaining. Then, she had said, "I want to hear it in the room, live, without warning, played from a speaker I am not facing." She had said, "Nora always believed the voice should arrive from somewhere you are not looking, because that is when you hear it most clearly. I want to hear it her way." She had also asked whether Nora Shelton's granddaughter was willing to be there that evening. The granddaughter had driven down from Sheffield that morning. She was sitting in the 8th row with the original reel-to-reel tape in her bag, because she had thought it was the right thing to bring, and she had been right. When Helen Mirren said, "Where did you find that?" Jimmy Fallon's voice returned to him the way voices return when they have been briefly overtaken, carefully, from the bottom up. "Her granddaughter sent it to us," he said. "She's here tonight." 8th row. Helen Mirren turned toward the 8th row. The granddaughter was standing. She had not decided to stand. The body had made that choice on its own, the way bodies do when something is moving toward them that requires standing for. Helen Mirren came down from the stage. She walked through the 1st rows and the 3rd and the 5th, and she stopped at the 8th, and she stood in front of the granddaughter, and she looked at her the way she has always looked at people. Fully, directly, with the complete attention of someone who is not behind glass. "How old was she when she said it to me?" Helen said. 57, the granddaughter said. "The same age you are in." She stopped. She smiled slightly. "In several of your most important performances." Helen Mirren was quiet for a moment. She didn't know she was being recorded. Not for that. She was being recorded for a book that was never written. She was just talking. She was always just talking. Helen's voice was very soft. That was the thing about Nora. She was never performing the teaching. She was just saying what was true. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. The granddaughter reached into her bag. She produced the reel-to-reel tape, the original in its original box, the label on the box in Nora Shelton's handwriting, a date in the early 1970s and nothing else, because she had not considered it worthy of a title, because she had simply been talking. The granddaughter held it out in both hands. Helen Mirren looked at the box. She looked at the handwriting on the label, the date, in Nora Shelton's hand, 50 years old, the ink slightly faded but entirely legible. She reached out and took it. She held it for a long time without speaking, turning it slightly in her hands, feeling its weight, looking at the handwriting. "The disappearing is the arriving," she said finally, very quietly. Not to the granddaughter, to the tape, to the woman whose voice was on it, to 58 years of work that had been built on 2 sentences said in an empty room in 1963. She used it in every class, the granddaughter said. Her students at Sheffield wrote it on the wall. It was still there when the school closed. Helen Mirren looked up at her. Did they know where it came from? She never told them. She said it belonged to the work, not to her. Helen Mirren stood in the 8th row of the Tonight Show studio with a reel-to-reel tape in her hands and the handwriting of a woman who had died 42 years ago on the box. And her face was doing nothing that was for anyone else in the room. She was standing in an empty room in London in 1963, and she was 17, and the teaching had just happened, and she was absorbing it. And the room around her, the 300 people, the cameras, the stage, the roots playing something low and warm in the distance, was present but peripheral, because some moments exist outside of rooms. She looked at the granddaughter. "I want to give you something," she said. "I have nothing with me that is adequate, but I want you to know that every performance you have seen from me in 58 years, every one, has had her voice in it. Not literally, but structurally. She is in the foundation of everything I have ever built." She paused. "I need you to have something that carries that. I want to think about what that is and send it to you." She did not wait to be asked. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at the granddaughter's home in Sheffield, handwritten, 4 pages, a complete account of the session in 1963, the room, the light, what Nora Shelton had been wearing, exactly what she had said, and exactly what it had done. Written from memory with the precision of a woman who had been keeping that memory carefully for 58 years because she understood from the beginning that it was worth keeping. Jimmy Fallon was sitting on the edge of his desk, both hands pressed together, his face entirely given over to what was happening, tears-free and unapologetic. He was not a television host in that moment. He was a man witnessing something completing itself after 60 years, and doing the only thing that was appropriate, which was to be present for it, without interfering, which is the hardest and most important thing anyone can do for anyone. 300 people were on their feet, as one, in the way that has no cue and requires none. The reel-to-reel tape now sits in Helen Mirren's home in Los Angeles, in a place she has not described publicly, alongside the letter she received from Nora Shelton's granddaughter, which contained 1 page the granddaughter had found separately, a single page torn from a workshop notebook, in Nora Shelton's handwriting, dated November 1963, which read, "H.M. Everything she needs already present. Work is the uncovering. She will do it." The 4-page letter Helen Mirren sent to Sheffield is framed now in the granddaughter's home, alongside a photograph of Nora Shelton taken in the early 1970s. A woman at a kitchen table with a cup of tea and a reel-to-reel recorder, looking not at the camera but at something slightly to the left of it, with the expression of someone entirely absorbed in thinking through something that matters. Jimmy Fallon has said, in the months since that Thursday evening, that the 36 seconds when Helen Mirren stood beside her chair and listened to a voice from a speaker above a door and said, "That's Nora," were the 36 seconds that most precisely explained to him what he had been given by the work, which was the chance on any given night to be in the room when something finished arriving. That had been in motion for 60 years. The drama school in Sheffield where Nora Shelton taught in her last working years closed in 2009. Before it closed, one of her former students removed the section of wall on which the sentence had been written, had it carefully framed, and donated it to the school's archive. The wall panel is cream-colored with the paint slightly yellowed by decades of a classroom, and on it, in black marker, in a student's handwriting, are the 2 sentences that traveled from a room in London in 1963 through 58 years of the most remarkable career in British acting, and arrived, one Thursday evening in October, in a room in New York where 300 people heard them for the first time and understood, all at once, that they had been living with the consequences of those sentences for their entire lives without knowing it. The disappearing is the arriving. Some teachers give their students the tools, and some give them the foundation, the thing under the tools, the thing that tells you what the tools are for, the thing you build on without always knowing what you are building on until the evening arrives, 60 years later, when you are standing in the 8th row of a television studio in New York with a tape box in your hands, and you hear the voice again, and you understand at last the full distance it has traveled, and the full weight of what it carried, and you are simply, completely undone.